February 1944, high above central Germany. The sky was thin and brittle at 25,000 feet, the kind of cold that numbed fingertips even through thick leather gloves. A formation of Luftwaffe Bf-109s cut across the pale horizon, engines humming in steady rhythm as they closed in on a distant American bomber stream. Their commander stared ahead through a frosted canopy, confident in one familiar truth: the Americans could not escort their bombers this deep. Not here, not today. Below them, the silver shapes of B-17s crawled across the sky like slow-moving constellations, vulnerable and exposed. The Germans prepared to dive. This was the moment they trained for, the moment they had dominated for months. But then it happened. A glint, a shadow, a formation where none should be. From above and astern, sleek shapes dropped out of the sun, fast, silent, predatory. The commander's breath caught as he recognized the silhouettes. Long wings, clean lines, Merlin roar. P-51 Mustangs. They weren't supposed to be here, not this far, not with this speed. In that instant, as the Mustangs swept down with impossible reach and terrifying precision, German pilots felt the first ripple of panic, because something fundamental had shifted in the war over Europe. And they realized too late that the sky no longer belonged to them. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had settled into a harsh rhythm, one defined by distances that favored the defender. From bases in England, American heavy bombers pushed deeper into the Reich with each passing month, striking factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and aircraft plants in an attempt to break Germany's industrial backbone. Yet the further they flew, the more vulnerable they became. Germany's defense network, radar stations, flak belts, and fighter bases thickened the deeper the bombers penetrated, and the Luftwaffe exploited this geography with ruthless efficiency. The United States possessed powerful fighters, the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt and the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, but neither had the range to escort bombers all the way to industrial targets like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, or Leipzig. Escort coverage ended at the German border, leaving the bombers alone for the most dangerous stretch of their missions. Luftwaffe pilots understood this gap perfectly. They waited just beyond escort range, forming large interception waves to tear into unprotected bomber formations. Losses mounted. In some raids, more than 1 in 5 American bombers never returned. American commanders faced a strategic crisis. Without long-range escort fighters, daylight bombing, central to U.S. air doctrine, risked becoming unsustainable. The 8th Air Force studied every possible solution: more armor for the bombers, improved defensive guns, new tactics. But none addressed the core problem. Germany controlled the skies deep inside its own territory, and American fighters simply could not fly far enough to challenge them. Across the Atlantic, however, a technological evolution was quietly taking shape. The North American P-51, originally designed for British needs, had shown promise, but lacked the altitude performance and range needed for deep escort duty. Its airframe was exceptional, sleek, efficient, built around a laminar flow wing that reduced drag dramatically. What it needed was the right engine. That breakthrough came when British engineers tested the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The transformation was immediate. Climb rate improved, high-altitude performance soared, and range expanded dramatically when paired with drop tanks. The Americans quickly recognized the opportunity. Packard began license building the Merlin in the United States, and the P-51B became a new kind of fighter, one capable of flying where no Allied escort had flown before. Meanwhile, the strategic situation in Germany was shifting. The Luftwaffe still fielded experienced aces, but their fighter force was under growing strain. Losses in Russia, reduced fuel for training, and the constant pressure of defending multiple fronts began to erode the once dominant German air arm. Despite these challenges, German commanders maintained confidence in their ability to defend the Reich. Their fighter bases were positioned effectively. Their radar network, built around the Freya and Würzburg systems, provided early tracking of incoming raids. And most importantly, they believed the Americans lacked the capability to escort fighters far enough to threaten their home skies. This belief shaped German expectations. Bomber streams, they assumed, would always arrive alone. Interceptors could mass without fear of long-range Allied fighters. Tactical planning centered on this assumption, and pilot morale rested on a familiar pattern. Avoid the escorts, wait for their return to England, then strike the exposed bombers. But in late 1943, hints of change began to appear. Rumors circulated among Luftwaffe pilots of a new American fighter operating at unexpected ranges. A few scattered engagements suggested an unfamiliar aircraft climbing with unusual speed. Yet German intelligence dismissed most of these reports, attributing them to misidentification or isolated tests. The truth was far more consequential. A new era of long-range escort was about to begin, one that would upend the Luftwaffe's assumptions and challenge its ability to maintain air superiority over its own territory. And as the winter of 1943 turned to 1944, the P-51 Mustang was preparing to enter the skies, not as an experiment, but as a force that would rewrite the rules of the air war. As 1943 drew to a close, the U.S. 8th Air Force prepared for a strategic shift, one driven not by greater numbers, but by the arrival of a fighter that could finally match the scale of America's ambitions. The P-51B, powered by the Packard-built Merlin engine, had completed its initial trials in England. Its range, once a limitation, had expanded dramatically thanks to the introduction of 75-gallon and later 108-gallon drop tanks. These simple, streamlined fuel containers would become one of the most influential pieces of hardware of the air war. With drop tanks attached, the Mustang could escort bombers far into Germany, farther than any Allied fighter had ever reached. Yet Germany had no reason to expect such a rapid change. Their intelligence networks, once formidable, had weakened significantly. Intercepted Allied communications were often decrypted too late to be meaningful, and field reports struggled to capture the scale of America's industrial capacity. Inside the Reich, the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy remained grounded in assumptions formed a year earlier. Fighter units were positioned at critical junctions, beyond escort range. Airfields in Münster, Kassel, Braunschweig, and Hanover served as launching points for interception waves. Radar operators tracked bomber streams across the North Sea and relayed updates to fighter controllers who directed squadrons toward expected points of vulnerability. Everything, from manpower deployment to fuel allocation, hinged on the belief that American escorts would eventually turn back, leaving the bombers exposed. But the Americans were preparing to overturn that logic entirely. By late 1943, bomber crews began to sense the shift. Word spread through briefings. New fighters are coming, fighters that could stay with them longer. Pilots who had endured the brutal Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions, where entire groups were cut apart by German interceptors, felt a guarded hope. If escorts could follow them deeper into Germany, survival rates might improve. Yet few understood just how transformative the P-51 would become. American strategic planners saw clearly what was at stake. If they could protect bombers throughout the entire mission, not just the first and last segments, the Luftwaffe's interception strategy would collapse. Germany relied heavily on timing. They massed fighters only when bombers were most vulnerable. The Mustang promised to disrupt that rhythm. At the same time, the Luftwaffe faced mounting internal pressures. Attrition in Russia had taken a severe toll. Training programs shortened dramatically due to fuel shortages and rising losses. Pilots received fewer flying hours and less advanced instruction. Veteran aces remained deadly, but their numbers were thinning. Each replacement unit arrived with less experience and confidence. Still, German command believed they retained a crucial advantage: the home field fighter network. They could climb quickly, intercept at altitude, and overwhelm bomber formations before American escorts could intervene. For years, this pattern had held true. Then came the winter missions of December 1943 and January 1944. Radar operators reported fighters near the bomber streams earlier than expected, too early. Some intercepted bomber crews claimed they saw fast, unfamiliar Allied aircraft still in formation hundreds of miles from the English coast. Luftwaffe pilots occasionally sighted what they thought were P-47s or P-38s, far beyond their usual range. Yet the sightings were inconsistent. Before the Mustang entered deep escort service, Luftwaffe pilots understood the geometry of air combat over Germany. They climbed to altitude ahead of the bombers, assembled into attack formations, and dove into the bomber stream with speed and positional advantage. Their goal was to break cohesion, force defensive gaps, and inflict maximum damage before American escorts could intervene. The P-51 shattered this geometry. With its laminar flow wing and Merlin engine, the Mustang could climb with the German Bf-109 and outrun the FW-190 at altitude. Its turning radius, though not the tightest, was reliable and predictable, allowing pilots to exploit vertical maneuvering with confidence. Most critically, the Mustang possessed a sustained high-speed envelope at 20,000 to 30,000 feet. This meant American pilots could engage, disengage, and re-engage with unprecedented freedom. For German interceptors, the shift was immediate and disorienting. The Mustang's arrival meant that no Luftwaffe attack could proceed uncontested. Escorts no longer lagged behind or turned out early. They remained overhead, shadowing German formations even before their initial dive toward the bombers. Every attack wave now faced opposition at altitude, in the climb, in the dive, and in withdrawal. Tactically, this was a revolution. German pilots felt hunted at every phase of engagement. Whereas the Luftwaffe once dictated when and how to strike, they now found themselves reacting to Mustang patrols that seemed to appear from nowhere, positioned perfectly to counter their maneuvers. The Luftwaffe's long-standing advantage, control of the intercept, was slipping away. Angle 2, technological angle. The Merlin engine and the Mustang's unmatched range. The heart of the Mustang's transformation lay beneath its streamlined cowling, the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650. This engine, a licensed American version of the British Merlin, delivered exceptional power at high altitude thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. While the original Allison engine struggled above 15,000 feet, the Merlin-equipped P-51 thrived at the altitudes where heavy bombers operated. This altitude advantage paired perfectly with the Mustang's laminar flow wing. Tested extensively in wind tunnels, the wing minimized drag and extended fuel efficiency. Combined with wing and fuselage fuel tanks and the new external drop tanks, the Mustang's operational range extended far beyond that of the P-34 or P-38. This range was not simply a technical specification, it was a strategic weapon. For the first time, American fighters could escort bombers from English bases over the North Sea across the entire width of Germany and back. Missions that once left bombers vulnerable for hours were now fully protected. The Luftwaffe's planning assumptions, built around known Allied escort limits, no longer applied. The Mustang's arrival also altered German engine expectations. The Daimler-Benz DB605 and BMW 801 engines performed well, but fuel quality had declined, maintenance capacity shrank, and spare parts grew scarce. German pilots increasingly fought in machines that could not match the sustained performance of a well-maintained Mustang.
Technological momentum, driven by American industrial capacity and the Merlin's high-altitude efficiency, shifted decisively to the United States. Angle 3, human angle. Luftwaffe fatigue versus U.S. pilot rotation and training. Behind the tactical and technological story lay a deeply human struggle. By 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter arm was exhausted. Years of attritional combat on multiple fronts had thinned the ranks of experienced pilots. Training programs were compressed from months to weeks as fuel shortages restricted flight hours. New pilots entered combat with only basic proficiency, unprepared for the high-speed, high-altitude engagements over Germany. Veteran aces still flew, but they carried the burden of increasingly lopsided odds. Many were flying multiple missions per day with little rest. Their replacements, lacking experience, were vulnerable even before encountering the Mustangs. American pilots faced danger as well, but their support system was dramatically different. Training programs were extensive, fuel was abundant, and pilot rotation ensured crews were rested and well prepared. The psychological advantage was immense. American pilots entered combat knowing they had the tools, aircraft, and organizational support to succeed. For German pilots, the appearance of Mustangs where no fighter should be, deep over the Reich, at the perfect altitude, was psychologically devastating. The sky, once a familiar and controlled battlefield, had become unpredictable. Each new engagement brought rising anxiety. Where are the Mustangs? When will they appear? By early 1944, panic was not a dramatic exaggeration, it was a creeping reality. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang coincided with a dramatic shift in American ant strategy, one driven by the leadership of Lieutenant General James "Jimmy" Doolittle. When he assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he inherited an air campaign struggling under unsustainable bomber losses. Escort fighters had been flying defensively, tethered tightly to bomber formations, responding reactively to German attacks. Doolittle changed everything. His philosophy was bold and uncompromising. Escort fighters were no longer simply to protect bombers. They were to destroy the Luftwaffe anywhere and everywhere it operated. To achieve this, he loosened formation restrictions, allowing Mustang groups to roam ahead, above, and around bomber streams. They were no longer tied to the bombers, they were hunters. This doctrinal shift exploited every strength of the P-51: range, speed, altitude performance, and maneuverability. Mustang pilots now sought out German interceptors before they reached the bomber stream, intercepting them during assembly or climb-out. They attacked Luftwaffe airfields during recovery phases. They disrupted command timing, broke apart formations, and denied the enemy the ability to mass forces. German commanders were stunned by this new level of American aggression. Their intercept tactics relied on careful coordination that Mustang sweeps shattered repeatedly. For the first time in the air war, the Luftwaffe found itself fighting on American terms. Doolittle's doctrine turned the Mustang into more than an escort fighter. It made it the instrument of Luftwaffe collapse. Angle 5, enemy perspective angle. German reports of Mustangs out of nowhere. Luftwaffe pilots documented their shock in combat reports, diaries, and post-war interviews. A recurring theme appeared across these accounts. The Mustangs arrived unexpectedly, often unseen until they were already in firing position. This perception was rooted not in myth, but in the Mustang's operational profile. From high altitude, the P-51 could dive at tremendous speed, using the sun or cloud cover to conceal its approach. Its silhouette was unfamiliar at first. Some German pilots mistook it for a Bf-109 or a P-34 until it was too late. And its extended range meant Luftwaffe pilots encountered Mustangs in airspace where no Allied fighter had ever appeared before. Their reports are filled with astonishment. They were above us before we even assembled. We believed the bombers were alone. Suddenly, the new fighters were everywhere. It became impossible to climb without being intercepted. These were not exaggerations. During early 1944, the Mustang's presence disrupted every stage of the Luftwaffe interception cycle. Pilots who once relied on altitude dominance now faced American fighters already positioned above them. German formations that once gathered safely for coordinated attacks were broken apart before their dive could begin. The psychological effect was profound. The sky, once predictable, had become hostile and uncertain, and every German pilot knew that somewhere above the bomber stream, hidden in the sunlight, the Mustangs were waiting. Angle 6, Operational Angle, how the Mustang crippled Germany's air defense system. Beyond individual combat, the P-51 struck at the organizational heart of the Luftwaffe's air defense strategy. Germany's defensive architecture relied on three components working in unison: radar detection, fighter assembly, and coordinated mass attack. The Mustang undermined all three. American radar-equipped escorts could position themselves to disrupt German formations at their most vulnerable moment, during assembly. Mustangs set upon climbing interceptors before they reached altitude, forcing them to break off or engage prematurely. This alone dismantled the timing that Luftwaffe controllers depended on. During the attack phase, the Mustang deprived German fighters of the freedom to choose when and how to strike. Escorts could now defend bombers at every point along the route, nullifying the Luftwaffe's earlier tactic of concentrating forces only at moments of bomber vulnerability. Finally, in the withdrawal phase, Mustangs pursued German fighters back toward their bases. This was unprecedented.
February 1944. Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. It was the moment when every assumption the Luftwaffe held about the air war would be tested and then shattered. In the pre-dawn cold, American bomber crews prepared for the first major strike of the week-long offensive. Their targets were Germany's aircraft factories, assembly plants, and ball-bearing works, the industrial lifeline of the Luftwaffe fighter arm. For years, these missions had been brutally costly. Bomber groups flew into the Reich unescorted for hours, and the Luftwaffe exploited that window with devastating effect. But on this morning, something was different. P-51 Mustang groups, newly organized and freshly fueled with long-range drop tanks, formed up alongside the bombers. They had trained for this moment. Their maps extended deeper into Germany than any American fighter had ever flown. Their orders were clear: escort the bombers all the way to the target and destroy anything that tried to stop them. Across Germany, radar stations began detecting large American formations crossing the North Sea. Fighter controllers scrambled to assemble intercept groups. At this early phase, the routine felt familiar. Interceptors typically had a predictable timeline to climb, form up, and launch coordinated attacks before the escorts turned home. But today, those escorts were not turning. As German fighters climbed toward the incoming bombers, they anticipated the usual pattern. Once across the coast, the American fighters would break off, leaving the bombers exposed. Luftwaffe pilots prepared to dive from above, massing in strong, disciplined formations. But they never reached that position. At 22,000 feet, a staffel of Bf-109s climbing out of Brunswick suddenly spotted movement above them. Small, dark shapes silhouetted against the pale winter sky. Before the German leader could identify them, those shapes folded into steep dives. They were Mustangs. The German formation scattered instantly. The attack had come earlier, higher, and more aggressively than any intercept pilot had experienced. For years, this airspace had been the Luftwaffe sanctuary, the climb zone where they gained altitude unchallenged. The Mustangs had violated that sanctuary. In the chaos that followed, American pilots executed Doolittle's doctrine to the letter. They struck during the climb, preventing German fighters from reaching firing altitude. They pursued those who broke away. They forced engagements on their own terms, fracturing the Luftwaffe's attack waves before they could be organized. For the bomber crews watching from below, the sight was astonishing. Instead of isolated American fighters struggling to stay in formation, the sky was now filled with escort groups diving, climbing, and circling, constantly disrupting German movement. The Luftwaffe's attack never materialized in coordinated strength. Their formations were broken apart piecemeal. In multiple sectors, German fighters succeeded in slipping through and making an attack run. But even then, the Mustangs remained in position. They swooped down on German attackers seconds after their first pass, forcing them to break early or abandon their attack altogether. The bombers, accustomed to absorbing devastating waves of machine gun and cannon fire, reported lighter losses than expected. Meanwhile, the Mustangs were not merely escorting, they were hunting. Far ahead of the main bomber stream, free-roaming Mustang groups intercepted German fighters still assembling over their own airfields. They caught entire formations before they gained altitude. They dove into return patterns. They disrupted takeoffs and landings. German airfields that once operated with precision now erupted in confusion as Mustangs appeared without warning. To Luftwaffe controllers watching their radar scopes, the situation devolved quickly. Intercept waves were not forming. Pilots were reporting attacks at unprecedented ranges. Communications grew frantic as multiple sectors cried out for assistance. By midday, the industrial targets were hit and the bombers began turning for home, still escorted, still protected. The Luftwaffe had failed to mount a cohesive defense. For German pilots, the psychological shock of the day was profound. They had encountered an enemy that fought differently, flew differently, and appeared where no escort fighter should be. And Big Week was only the beginning. In the days following the initial strikes of Big Week, the Luftwaffe braced itself for another round of bombing raids. German commanders hoped that the first day's confusion had been an aberration, an unfortunate convergence of timing, weather, and miscommunication. They believed their defensive network could still hold, provided they restored coordination and attacked in concentrated waves. But the Mustangs were already rewriting the rules of engagement. Day 2. The collapse of interception rhythm. When American radar-equipped escort groups crossed into German airspace again, Luftwaffe units attempted to climb into position more quickly. Yet before they reached altitude, they encountered the same relentless obstacle, P-51s. This time, the Mustangs arrived even earlier. American fighter direction had refined its timing. German formations attempting to climb from airfields near Kassel and Göttingen were intercepted immediately after takeoff. The Mustangs dove in with speed the German fighters couldn't match as they struggled to gain altitude. Pilots reported being attacked at altitudes where they had previously been safe, 8,000, 10,000, then 15,000 feet. The Mustangs were everywhere. German air controllers, working from radar stations across the Reich, struggled to understand how American fighters were penetrating so deeply and appearing above their interceptors. The logic of the previous years no longer applied. The Luftwaffe's timing advantage, built around the expectation of escort withdrawal, had been erased. The turning point: Doolittle's free hunt doctrine. As the bombers pushed toward their targets, Mustangs were unleashed in roaming groups. These fighters spread out ahead of the bomber stream, sweeping known Luftwaffe assembly areas and flight corridors. They struck climbing formations from above, broke apart squadrons attempting to regroup, and chased down stragglers. For the first time in the war, German pilots found themselves on the defensive even before they reached their attack positions. They were forced to choose between climbing to intercept altitude while under pressure from Mustangs or remaining lower and failing to reach the bombers in time. Neither option worked.
Doolittle's order transformed escort fighters from reactive guardians into proactive predators. Every Luftwaffe tactic, split climbs, diving attacks, staggered formations, was countered by Mustangs already positioned to disrupt them. German panic and the fracturing of the fighter arm. Across multiple days of Big Week, the psychological impact intensified. Luftwaffe pilots began to report Mustangs appearing at impossible angles, above clouds, out of the sun, descending from altitudes they believed unreachable. Some described the encounters as sudden or out of nowhere, not because the Mustangs were invisible, but because German pilots had never before faced fighters with both the range and high-altitude performance to execute such attacks. The panic was real. Veteran pilots accustomed to knowing the limits of Allied escorts struggled to adapt. Younger pilots with far fewer flight hours were overwhelmed. The Luftwaffe's long-standing control over its own airspace was slipping away in real time. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. German fighters couldn't loiter or reposition as needed. Mustangs with their efficient engines and drop tanks could. The break point, when the Luftwaffe realized the war had changed. By the final days of Big Week, the Luftwaffe no longer resembled the elite force that had once dominated European skies. It was battered, disorganized, and demoralized. Losses mounted at a pace Germany couldn't replace. Even when German fighters managed to form attack waves, Mustangs intercepted them en route or shattered their cohesion seconds before they reached the bombers. Bomber crews reported an unprecedented sight. Luftwaffe formations breaking off early, sometimes without making a single pass. The air war had turned. Big Week was intended to destroy German aircraft production, and it did. But its deeper impact was psychological and tactical. Germany's last advantage, its fighter dominance over the Reich, had been erased. The P-51 Mustang, with its speed, reach, and new offensive doctrine, had transformed the strategic balance of the war. And within months, the skies over Europe would belong entirely to the United States Army Air Forces. The immediate aftermath of Big Week revealed a Luftwaffe invisible crisis. Although German aircraft factories suffered severe physical damage, the deeper blow was to the fighter arm itself. Losses during Big Week reached levels Germany couldn't sustain. Experienced aces, already stretched thin by years of attrition, were killed, wounded, or grounded. Replacement pilots rushed through abbreviated.
With the Luftwaffe reeling from catastrophic losses during Big Week and the months that followed, the strategic consequences unfolded with a momentum Germany could no longer resist. What began as a shift in escort capability had become a collapse of the Reich's entire air defense structure. The P-51 Mustang was not solely responsible for this collapse, but it was the instrument through which American air power fully realized its potential. The Mustang's domination over Europe. By late spring 1944, the P-51 had become the backbone of Allied air superiority. Fighter groups equipped with Mustangs swept across Western Europe with unprecedented freedom. They escorted bombers, hunted enemy fighters, and attacked airfields, rail junctions, and convoys. Mustang squadrons flew as deep as Silesia and Romania, pursuing German aircraft attempting to flee or relocate. No region within the Luftwaffe's defensive network was beyond reach. German diaries and memoirs reflect a growing sense of inevitability. Pilots described feeling surrounded in the sky, unable to climb without encountering American fighters. Ground crews reported entire squadrons returning with fewer and fewer aircraft. Commanders struggled to assemble coherent defensive plans when their formations were attacked during takeoff, assembly, engagement, and retreat. The Luftwaffe's ability to regenerate its strength was effectively broken. Impact on Germany's war economy. The collapse of air superiority had immediate effects on Germany's industrial output. Factories once considered safe deep within the Reich now faced continuous bombing. Production facilities for aircraft engines, ball bearings, synthetic fuels, and armored vehicles suffered repeated strikes. Supply chains were disrupted. Transportation networks were crippled. Repair facilities operated without adequate protection, forcing many to shut down or relocate. More significantly, the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee safe passage for transport or logistics aircraft. Without reliable air cover, movements of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts became strained. This shortage of resources exacerbated the crisis across every branch of the German military. The road to D-Day. By the time Allied planners prepared for the Normandy invasion, the situation in the skies was clear. The Luftwaffe could not mount a large-scale response. Reconnaissance flights documented the near-total absence of German fighters over northern France. When the invasion fleet crossed the Channel on June 6, 1944, fewer than a handful of German aircraft appeared, and none were able to disrupt the landings in any meaningful way. The Mustangs played a critical role in this dominance. They patrolled the invasion corridors, swept ahead of transport formations, and attacked any Luftwaffe aircraft attempting to reach the beaches. German pilots who attempted to intervene found themselves heavily outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and often intercepted long before reaching Allied positions. The final decline of the Luftwaffe. The last hopes for Germany's Air Force rested on advanced aircraft like the Me-260 jet. Yet even these revolutionary machines arrived too late and in too few numbers, often grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed during takeoff by prowling Mustangs. The Luftwaffe's operational collapse during 1944 ensured that Germany entered the final months of the war blind and exposed. Allied ground forces advanced under an umbrella of overwhelming air superiority. Every movement of German troops, armor, or supply convoys risked discovery and attack. Airfields were no longer havens, they were targets. By early 1945, surviving German pilots spoke openly of their dread when entering combat. They knew the Mustangs would be there, somewhere above, somewhere unseen, waiting for the moment to strike. The air war over Europe had been decided not by numerical superiority alone, but by the arrival of a fighter that extended American reach into the very heart of the Reich. The P-51 Mustang had transformed the conflict. In the long sweep of the air war over Europe, few moments were as transformative or as symbolic as the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in the skies of Germany. It was more than a new aircraft. It was a shift in momentum, a rebalancing of power, and a demonstration of how engineering, doctrine, and determination could change the fate of a continent. For years, the Luftwaffe had defined aerial warfare over Europe. Its pilots controlled the rhythm of battle, choosing when to climb, when to strike, and when to retreat. American bombers flew into a world shaped by German experience and dominance. The sky belonged to the defenders. But the Mustang changed that ownership. Its appearance removed the last advantage the Luftwaffe possessed, the protection of distance. Suddenly, no altitude was safe. No formation could assemble without risk. No airfield could operate without fear of swift retribution from above. German pilots, once confident in their understanding of Allied limits, now faced an enemy whose reach seemed boundless, whose timing appeared flawless, and whose presence reshaped every expectation of the air war. The psychological impact was as profound as the tactical one. The Luftwaffe's confidence, built through years of hard-won expertise, eroded under the constant pressure of a fighter that should not have been there, yet always was. American pilots, meanwhile, discovered a sense of empowerment they had never known. The Mustang gave them the ability not only to protect the bombers, but to take the fight directly to the enemy. In this transformation lies a broader truth about warfare. Victory often belongs not to the side that begins strongest, but to the one that adapts fastest. Germany entered the war with an unrivaled fighter force, but could not sustain or evolve it. The United States entered with limitations, but possessed the industrial, technological, and doctrinal flexibility to overcome them. The P-51 Mustang became the embodiment of that shift. A machine that extended more than range, it extended possibility. And in the cold, high air over Europe, it closed the chapter on Luftwaffe dominance and opened the path to Allied victory.